Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Why would anybody go through life drinking bad coffee? It's like a disgrace. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, the best coffee on the planet. You can find them at 4501 McPherson. Or, if you don't live in Laredo, you can order at organicmancoffeetrike.shop. The absolute best coffee on the planet. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about Khamar Daban. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Everybody listening to the show should already be familiar with the most famous group of students to run into the unknown in Russia, the Dyatlov Pass group. Just to bring the few folks up to speed, January 1959, 10 hikers, all but one students at the Urals Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, began a hike into the Ural Mountains. They were led by Igor Dyatlov. All 10 were experienced hikers. They had planned a 3-week trip with a return to be on February 12th. One of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, left early because he became sick. Didn't think he'd be able to keep up with the others, and you don't want to be abandoned out in the middle of a snow-covered mountain or to cause the rest of the group to have to carry him and his pack. So he got on the train and headed back home. In Russia, it's all the craze for students to do wilderness hikes. It was a way of preparing the young throughout Russia for the next big war, and it let people who didn't go to college see the ones getting a higher education were pretty much the same as them, and kind of bring the two groups together. The group didn't arrive back home February 12th as they said they would, but nobody was really that concerned. Wilderness hikers had a tendency on occasion to run into a problem and get delayed. They could have been slowed down. The families, however, became worried when they hadn't heard anything by the 20th, so a search party was sent out. Rescuers came across their tent a few days later, but the scene left everybody with more questions than answers. The tent had been cut open from the inside. The hikers had scrambled into the freezing cold night in only their underwear. When at long last the bodies were found, the mystery only deepened. 2 men were found frozen to death after having tried to start a fire. There was evidence that they had tried climbing a tree to more than likely get a view of their former campsite. 3 more of the group were found dead in a line which indicated they'd been trying to crawl back to the tent. They showed no signs of having been in They showed signs of having been in a fight, but none of the injuries could be connected to any of the other hikers. The last 4 were found in a ravine where they had built a snow hut. The small construction had been put together, but none of the bodies were found inside. 2 of these students showed high levels of radiation. One of the hikers was missing parts of her face and her tongue. All of them looked as if they'd been in a major vehicle accident. As the investigators dug on, more questions came up, never answering any of the original questions. Even today, the so-called investigation came to the conclusion the students had run from an avalanche But the mountain they had died on wasn't steep enough to support such a natural disaster. I watched that docudrama about the Yeti. It just kind of fell short in my book. Not that there couldn't be a huge hair-covered creature running around the area. It's just the evidence was lacking. A Yeti attacks and kills 9 hikers, and as its reward to itself, it eats one tongue. Just one. Either the Yeti was a tongue connoisseur, or it wasn't very hungry. I know they were trying to make a show, and they started out with the predetermined conclusion. This show did a lot of reaching. There you have it in a nutshell. I did an entire show on the Dyatlov Pass incident. If you'd like to hear it, just search Strange Things with Chris James Dyatlov Pass. The show was back in December 16th, 2016, the first year I was doing this. It looks as if having bizarre hiking trips is all the rage in Russia. I saw a video on YouTube about one which led to another and another. Here are some good reasons to not go hiking in Russia. August 2nd, 1993, a team of 7 hikers pushed out into the wilds of the Khamar Daban mountain range of southern Siberia, remote Byutia region. They were in good hands, led by a seasoned and experienced hiking instructor and a survivalist named Lyudmila Korovina. The weather forecast called for clear skies and calm weather. 6 of the hikers were Korovina's students: Tatyana Filipenko, who was 24, Alexander Kayusin, who was 23, Denis Shvachenkin, who was 19, Victoria Salasova, 16, Timur Bapanov, who was 15. They have some strange names in Russia, but they probably think our names are strange, and Valentina Uchenko, who was 17. The plan was they were going to meet up with a second hiking group on August 5th, which was being led by Lyudmila's daughter, Natalia. They'd been planning and preparing for this trek for months. It was expected to be a routine hike in pleasant, sunny weather. Any time you're going hiking to get away from the city and see nature, you have to plan for the worst. On a day hike, you need to take food and more water than you think you might need. You should also carry something to make a shelter in case of heavy rain. I carry an old army poncho and some cord to make a hasty shelter. You need something to start a fire, and you need to know how to start a fire without burning down the forest. These folks in Russia knew what they were doing. They had done similar hikes over the years. It's amazing how, when things go bad, they can go really bad. For the first leg of the hike, things went smoothly. The weather was perfect, the summer landscape not particularly challenging, and they were making a great time, even better than they had expected. March 4th, things changed for the worse. The weather suddenly and unpredictably changed, with cold rain and snow pouring down to the point they were forced to stop their hike and set up camp and wait out the inhospitable weather. Hiking in the rain is fine as long as you're walking on smooth, level ground. Hiking through the mountains, well, that's a whole other thing. Korovina instructed her team to set up camp in an open area away from the trees. Some folks question this. I've been told this is the smart thing to do so you don't get hit by lightning. If it was just snow, the trees would have been a good spot, but if there was a chance of thunderstorm, the open was a better choice. Also, if you do decide to set up camp under the trees and the snow becomes quite heavy, well, it can bring a bunch of branches down on your head. The campsite was on a slope. Some say this was not a good idea. If you want the water to run off, then maybe it was a judgment call on her part. She was an experienced hiker. The hikers made it through the storm unscathed. By morning, the storm had passed and they broke camp and headed on their way. On the fourth day, August 5th, Natalia arrived at the prearranged rendezvous point with her own team. Korovina's group was nowhere to be seen. Thinking that they must have just been held up by bad weather, Natalia's team continued on, thinking they'd meet up later with their other group. Korovina never arrived. It wasn't until August 10th that any sign of the missing group would be found. A group of kayakers were going along a river in the area when they came across a girl on the shore with blood on her clothes. The girl frantically waved them down, and they pulled ashore to help her. She was obviously in great distress. When the group in the kayaks approached her, she began telling a story that didn't seem to make much sense. Thinking this young woman must have had a terrible ordeal, the kayakers took her to the nearest town and contacted the authorities. This girl turned out to be Valentina Yushchenko, a part of the missing Korovina hiking group, and she had quite a bizarre tale to tell. According to her, on the morning of the 5th, the continuing bad weather had forced Korovina to make the decision to head back down the mountain rather than to try continuing hiking the mountain. Right after eating breakfast, Korovina got everybody headed in the right direction. After only a few minutes walking, the last hiker in the group, Alexander Krysin, began yelling and screaming. When everyone turned to see what was wrong, they saw he was bleeding from the eyes and the ears. He was also frothing at the mouth. He fell to the ground convulsing, and then he went still. Korovina tried to tend to him, but she ordered the rest of the group to keep going. Before the group was more than a few steps away, she started exhibiting the same symptoms of foaming at the mouth and blood coming from her ears, nose, and eyes, before she fell to the ground convulsing and then became still also. Tatiana ran to try to help her fallen leader, and then she too began convulsing. Then, bizarrely, she crawled over to a bunch of rocks, and she began hitting her head on the rocks until she fell over, either unconscious or dead. Dennis began to hide behind rocks before he ran away into the trees. Two more of the girls fell at once. They began rolling around on the ground, tearing at their clothes and grabbing at their throats. It quickly devolved into chaos. The group dropped to the ground, screaming, making animalistic sounds, clawing at their throats, ripping at their clothing. There was blood coming from everywhere. Valentina was about to succumb to the same symptoms, but one of the hikers kicked her, yelling for her to keep going. She somehow managed to stumble down the trail, keeping her feet under her through some miracle. Valentina made it a short distance before collapsing to the ground. She managed to pull her sleeping bag out from her backpack and curled up in it, and then lay there unconscious. When she finally came to the next morning, she walked back to where the others had been. Everybody looked as if they were dead. There was no sign of any life. She took a few minutes to close everyone's eyes and gather what she thought she might need to survive. She walked away down the mountain. Valentina wandered along the trail, always heading downhill any time she could. When she came to an electric line running through the area, she began following it until she came to the river. By this time, she had been alone for 5 days. She still had no idea what had happened to all of her friends. According to one report, as soon as the authorities had questioned Valentina, they set out on a recovery mission. The bodies were found scattered over a small area where Valentina had said they would be. The bodies were carried down to the village where they would be examined to try to determine what had killed all of these hikers. In a second report, the recovery mission didn't set out until the 24th, 14 days after Valentina had arrived in the village. One reason given was Valentina couldn't tell exactly where the bodies might be. If this were the case, the authorities would have set out trying to locate the bodies by air. There would always have been a possibility that one or two of them might still be alive. I wonder, did they wait until somebody, maybe back in Moscow, told them it was okay to venture into the mountains to recover the dead hikers? Why the long wait between hearing about a group of hikers who, one or two, may still be alive, and setting out on a recovery mission instead of a rescue? The official statement said all the students had died from hypothermia, except for Ludmilla, who had had a heart attack. Case closed. Nothing to see here. Go on about your business and keep hiking those mountains. The authorities never came up with an explanation for all the blood coming from the hikers. You don't foam at the mouth or bleed to death from hypothermia. The signs and symptoms sounded more like acute congestive heart failure. This wouldn't have explained Tatiana suddenly beating her own brains out. Hypothermia doesn't make you claw at your body trying to remove clothing. Why did Dennis try to hide from the others and then run away into the trees? To add a lot of mystery to the case, Natalia, Ludmilla's daughter, was paid a huge amount of money to go away and not ask any questions. Hypothermia occurs as your body temperature falls below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the core temperature. When your body temperature drops, your heart, nervous system, and other organs can't work normally. Left untreated, hypothermia can eventually lead to complete failure of your heart and respiratory system, and eventually death. Valentina had said Alexander Kyson had suddenly began to foam at the mouth and scream before he collapsed. They had just left camp and were neither wet nor starving. The hikers had been eating sufficiently to maintain their body inner workings. The weather was cold and wet, but the hikers were wearing the proper gear for this. The idea that 6 healthy hikers would all suddenly die from hypothermia within a few minutes of each other is, to me, just plain weird. They had been preparing for this trip for months. They knew, they knew what they were doing. They had the right gear to survive. So what caused them to become crazed and die? Some are trying to say these hikers had stumbled upon some secret military thing out there in the mountains, and the soldiers had killed 6 of them, but they let one escape. Escape with no food or water, then return to the scene of the crime to gather supplies and stumble about the woods for 5 days. It just doesn't sound like the answer. If the military was going to murder 6 people, I doubt they would allow a witness to wander off. One official said the leader of the hiking group was inexperienced, and this led to the group getting into the situation where they were ill prepared for. Ludmilla had been on dozens of wilderness expeditions and was considered by just about everybody to be one of the best. She knew the area they were hiking. She knew how to cope with the weather, and she knew the wildlife and the plants. She was known as a forager who taught the arts to her students. If possible, or it is possible, that one of the hikers may have found some mushrooms to add to their breakfast, which wasn't the correct variety. After eating their breakfast, the effects of the mushroom poisoning began to take hold as they were walking, causing them to hallucinate and become sick. Interestingly, a common hallucination caused by psilocybin is to see other people crying blood. Overdoses of psilocybin can cause psychosis, convulsions, cardiac arrest, and even send someone into a coma. Once the hiker has passed out, their bodies were now exposed to the elements, and this led to them dying from hypothermia. They said that Valentina could have survived because perhaps she didn't eat as many mushrooms as the others, or maybe she had some kind of a predetermined tolerance, or even just a genetic disposition to being less affected. As people learned about this bizarre incident, the theories began to pile up. Many people have pointed out that the symptoms described by Valentina were consistent with death by chemical weaponry, specifically nerve agents. The frothing at the mouth and the convulsing, in particular, match death by a strong nerve agent. This death also matches with the autopsy results, since contact with nerve agent can cause respiratory distress. The bruising of the lungs could be a sign of death by nerve gas. A cardiac arrest is also caused by nerve agents, which match Ludmilla's cause of death. The cause of death of the other hikers could very well be hypothermia, even if they were exposed to a nerve toxin, since they could have been knocked unconscious or fallen into a coma, and then ultimately succumb to exposure. Novichok gas is a class of nerve agent created by the Soviet Russia in 1993, which happens to be the year of the incident. They are thought to be the deadliest nerve agents to exist, being 10 times more deadly than VX and 20 times more deadly than sarin. Novichok agents were reportedly tested in the area near Khamar Daban. Exposure to this gas causes rapid death, similar to what the hikers reportedly experienced. Nerve agents are soluble in water. They can take up to 4 months to evaporate. They are made of heavy particles that often float close to the ground, and the stronger ones can be hazardous in a location where they are used long after they were first released. The theory says the military tested Novichok in the area months before the hikers walked through the area. The gas became trapped in some cave or low area. When the rainstorm came through, it washed the nerve agent into the air right as the hikers were walking by. Had this been the case, why was Valentina not killed by the deadly gas? Perhaps she was just in the right spot at the right time to escape. The Soviets were notorious for testing chemical weapons on people, kind of like our own government was at the time. Some have theorized the hikers had ingested water contaminated from some unknown chemicals that caused them to bleed and act crazy. Valentina was spared because maybe she didn't drink or ingest as much of the bad water as the others. Lake Baikal is above the area where the campers had spent their last night. Lake Baikal is the largest freshwater lake on Earth. It is bigger than all of the Great Lakes combined. The water used to be considered fresh enough to drink without any processing. Today it is regarded as unsafe for animals, and never mind humans. Since ancient times, Lake Baikal was known as being deeply mysterious, as well as very deep. In the closing years of the Soviet era, and after, the lake has been the location of a number of sightings of both aliens and UFOs. Initially, these were covered up by the authorities, but later they were revealed by the Russian media. The folks who live or work on and around the lake have reported seeing all kinds of UFOs and alien-looking creatures. In 1982, 7 military divers reportedly came in contact with aliens under the water. Alexei Tivanenko, a director of history, said, at a depth of 160 feet, they met swimmers who were about 10 feet tall, and they looked like they were half man, half shark. They were dressed in tight-fitting, silvery suits. They didn't have any kind of scuba or other devices, just a kind of a helmet on their heads. The divers were ordered to go back down and catch one of these creatures. Being in the Soviet military, they did as they were told, descending back down to 160 feet. Once underwater, they encountered some of these fish people. A battle of sorts took place, and the Russian divers fled for the surface. It's a bad idea, since they didn't go through decompression. Once on the surface, the military team only had one decompression chamber, so 4 of the men were stuffed in one, and the other 3 were just left there to die. Could Ludmilla and her students have accidentally ingested some form of alien bacteria, or even a parasite that killed 6 of them? The Soviet doctors, doing the autopsy, would have been ordered to disregard any alien evidence and close the case. I know it's a bad idea to try explaining an unknown occurrence by using other unknown explanations. It's also a bad idea to disregard a possible answer because it sounds unbelievable. By saying it couldn't have happened this way because I don't believe it could isn't science. It's turning a blind eye to what just might be true. Had Ludmilla and her fellow hikers been killed by the Soviet military or some alien contamination, this would explain why Natalia Korovina was paid to go away and stop asking questions. Why then didn't Valentina Utachenko receive any money? Ludmilla was a well-known hiking instructor, and she had a lot of followers. Many of her students from the past were shocked by her sudden death and appalled by the idea she had somehow been instrumental in her own death and that of 5 students. I don't see much reason for the Soviet to pay off anyone to try keeping the story from blowing up. Valentina Utchenko was a 17-year-old student with no real clout on what might happen after the hikers had died. I don't want anybody to think I'm picking on the Russians, especially the KGB. Really, I'm not making fun of you guys, so stop keeping an eye on me. That goes for the CIA and the NSA as well. We had a group go missing right here in the United States back in 1978. These men weren't hiking in the woods. What makes their bizarre demise so weird is where the men were eventually found. During his army service in West Germany in the early 1970s, Gary Mathias, a Yuba City native, had developed a bit of a drug problem. These were not all that unusual since a lot of folks were in the Army despite their wishing to be somewhere else. A lot of drugs get used in the military. I remember one night we were sitting out in an encampment. We had our tanks pulled up in a tactical circle of sorts, and I was just laying on the fender watching the stars, and I could smell somebody was smoking marijuana somewhere in our tight little circle. Now, to begin with, this is a pretty stupid thing to do when you're in a military installation surrounded by a lot of sergeants and above who were going to take exception to your using illegal substances. Well, somebody just didn't think, I guess. I also remember a time they were telling us, just in formation, that there were going to be periodic drug tests. One or two of us were going to be sent away to pee in a cup and have it examined. And one of the not-too-bright soldiers raised his hand and he asked the first sergeant, he actually asked him, "How long does marijuana stay in your system so that it won't show up on a drug test?" Guess who was the first guy in line to go pee in a cup? Anyway, getting back to Gary Mathias, he returned to his parents' home in California after being ejected from the military. They also had discovered that he was having schizophrenia and psychiatric problems. Once back home, he started having problems keeping up with his treatment. He was nearly arrested for assault twice and would often suffer psychotic episodes that usually landed him in the local Veterans Administration. By 1978, he was being treated as an outpatient with stelazine and colgatine and was considered by his psychiatrists to be one of their stellar success cases. Stelazine is an anxiety medication. A funny thing, one of its side effects is anxiety. Colgatine is used for treating Parkinson's disease in combination with other medications. It is also used to control tremors and stiffness of the muscles due to certain antipsychotic medications. So he's being treated for his psychotic episodes, and then he's also being treated for the treatment that they're giving him. Mathias supplemented his disability pay from the government by working in his stepfather's gardening business. When not at work, he began developing a friendship with 4 men he had met while receiving treatment. They all had slight mental disabilities, and they all liked basketball. Bill Sterling was 29. He also lived at home with his folks. At one time, he'd been working for several locations, but his fellow workers would take advantage of him, so his parents kept him at home and took care of him. Sterling was deeply religious, and he would spend hours at the library reading books in an effort to be able to bring Jesus to the patients in the mental hospital. He and Mathias were closer to each other than any of the rest. Jack Hewitt was 24. He also lived at home with his folks. He was unable to hold a job for very long due to his mental state. Ted Weir was 32 and living at home, totally dependent on his parents for everything. Jack Madruga was 30, with an intellect of a much younger person. He also lived at home with his folks. These 5 men all lived in either Yuba City or nearby Marysville. They all lived with their parents. Their parents knew who all of the others were, as well as their families, because they wanted to know who their kids were hanging out with. The parents referred to these 5 as the boys. The 5 men's favorite leisure activity was sports. Their families said that when they got together, it was usually to play a game or to watch one. They played basketball together in a team they had named the Gateway Gators. The team was sponsored by a local program for the mentally handicapped. February 25th, the Gateway Gators were due to play their first game in a week-long tournament sponsored by Special Olympics. The winners would get a free, week-long vacation in Los Angeles. The 5 men had prepared the night before. Some had gone as far as to lay out their uniforms and any equipment they thought they might need. Several of the men had told their parents to be sure and wake them up in case they missed their alarm. The night before the big game, the Gators decided they were going to drive to Chico, a town about 50 minutes away, to cheer on the UC Davis basketball team in an away game against Chico State. Madruga and Matthias were the only members of the team with driver's licenses, so Madruga was going to drive the team in his 1969 Mercury Montego. The plan was to see the game and then head back to their homes to rest up for the big game the next day. They headed out dressed for cool weather and a night of fun. After the Davis team won the game, the group got back into the Madruga's car and they drove a short distance from the Chico State campus to Bears Market in downtown Chico. They bought some road snacks, sodas, cartons of milk, and then began heading home. The store had been about to close for the evening, so the clerk remembered seeing these 5 men as they came in to shop. Being just a bit off, the 5 would have kind of stood out, especially in a small store at the end of the shift. The clerk later remembered them because she was a bit upset, thinking the men were lingering too long, making her have to stay past the end of her shift. She still had to go through the receipts and check the store before getting out. The 5 men paid for their stuff, walked out the door, and were never seen alive again. Their parents became worried when the boys were late getting back home. They should have been there no later than midnight. By morning, the police received several calls from the 5 men's families. The thought on everybody's mind was the men were broke down somewhere along the road home, or they may have taken a wrong turn and got lost. The police notified the authorities along Route 70 to be on the lookout for the turquoise and white Montego. Police in Butte and Yuba counties began searching along the route the men took to Chico. They checked all the out-of-the-way places the 5 might have stopped for whatever reason. Maybe a bathroom break or to take a quick nap. There was no sign of the 5 men or the car. Clerks and attendants at stations and grocery stores were asked about seeing the 5 men. Police and sheriff's deputies drove along any back roads looking for them. A forest ranger at Plumas National Forest told investigators that he had seen the turquoise and white Montego parked along Oroville-Quincy Road in the forest on November 25th. At the time of the sighting, it had not looked odd, since many residents often drove up to the Sierra Nevada on winter weekends to go cross-country skiing. Sightseers would often park along the sides of the road to go hiking through the woods. Once the ranger read the missing person bulletin, he recognized the car and he led the deputies to it on February 28th. The car didn't appear to have been stolen. It was just parked on the side of the road. Inside the car, the police found evidence suggesting the men had been in it from when they'd stopped in Chico up until it was parked in the woods. There were wrappers and empty cartons and cans that the men had purchased in Chico. The police also found programs from the basketball game they'd attended and a neatly folded road map of California. Finding the car raised more questions than it answered. Why was it parked 70 miles from Chico, far off any direct route back to Yuba City or Maryville? None of the men's family could think of any reason they might have driven up a long, winding dirt road on a winter night deep into the high elevation of a remote forest. None of the men had been wearing clothing for the situation, and since they had planned to spend the evening either in the car or at the stadium. The men had been excited about competing in the basketball game the next morning. They would have wanted to get home and rest up. Madruga's parents said he did not like cold weather and had never been into the mountains. Sterling's father had once taken his son to the area near where the car was found for a fishing weekend, but the young man had not enjoyed it and remained at home any time after that his father went fishing. Police could not figure out why the men had abandoned the car. They'd driven up the road until they reached 4,400 feet. This was where the snow was accumulating on the roads. Just a short distance further, the road had been closed due to snow making it hard to drive any further. The mountain roads were being closed down for the winter months. The car looked as if it may have gotten stuck in a snowdrift. Just some deep snow that had blown onto the road. There was evidence that the wheels had spun in an attempt to get going. Police noted the snow wasn't that deep, and that 5 healthy young men should have been able to push it out. It looked like 1 or 2 of them could have easily freed the vehicle. The doors were all unlocked, and 1 window was rolled down. The keys were not in the ignition or anywhere around the vehicle, suggesting that the car might have been abandoned because it had run out of gas or had some mechanical difficulties. Maybe the 5 had decided to hike back down the road to look for help. When the police managed to get the car fired up, it showed no signs of problems, and it still had a quarter tank of gas. The police towed the vehicle back to town, and then they examined it thoroughly. The Mercury's undercarriage had no dents, gouges, or even mud scrapes, not even on the low-hanging muffler. There were no mud splashes up the sides of the car that would have been there if the driver had gone at a normal rate of speed. The car had been driven a long distance up a mountain road with bumps, ruts, broken pavement, and mud puddles. Either the driver had been extremely careful, or he was somewhat familiar with the road. Madruga's family all said he was not in the least bit familiar with mountain roads. They were also emphatic in saying he would never allow anyone else to drive his car. It was his, and he was the only one to drive it. The car being left unlocked and with 1 window rolled down was something he would never do. He was attached to this car. He would not leave it like that. The police and the sheriff's department wanted to search the surrounding woods to see where the 5 had gone, but a snowstorm came in and made working the woods impossible. It got so bad the rescuers nearly got lost just a short distance off the road. There was nothing anyone could do to try finding the missing men until the weather improved. In response to local media coverage of the case, police received reports of some of the men on occasion, all of the men being sighted once in a while, in all manner of strange locations. Reports came in from all over California saying 1 or 2 or sometimes all 5 men were in some town miles from where they should have been. Most of these reports could easily be dismissed. However, 2 reports did stand out. Joseph Scones of Sacramento told police he inadvertently wound up spending the night of February 24th near where the Montego was found. he had decided to take a drive up the mountain where he had a cabin in the woods. He wanted to check the snowfall to see if it was sufficient for cross-country skiing. He was driving up the mountain road at 5:30 p.m. when he got stuck in a snowdrift. After trying to get his car unstuck, he began to feel uneasy. He became short of breath, and his chest felt tight. Thinking this just might be a heart attack, he got back in the car to try to relax and stay warm. Around 6 hours later, he said he was laying across the seats trying to stay warm and not thinking about his chest pain when he saw headlights come up from behind. Hoping to get the car behind him to help get his car unstuck or at least give him a lift into town, Joseph rolled down the window and leaned out. He said he could see a vehicle parked on the side of the road quite a ways behind him. There was a group of people standing around this vehicle. One of them looked to be a woman holding a child. As he sat there wondering what was going on, he spotted some flashlights around where the other car was parked. He tried yelling from where he was to get them to come forward to him, but they either didn't hear him or they ignored him. He said he yelled back to the group, and when he did, somebody turned the car's lights off and all the flashlights were extinguished. Later, Scones said he thought maybe a pickup had pulled in a little closer behind his vehicle, maybe 20 feet from his back bumper. He wasn't too sure because his chest pain was causing him to feel delirious. After a few minutes, the pickup drove on down the road. Sometime in the early morning hours, Scones' car ran out of gas. It started to get cold fast. He considered which would be worse, stay in the car and freeze to death, or try walking up the road to a lodge and maybe die from a heart attack halfway there. Scones set out on foot to try for the lodge. He managed to walk to the place and knock on the door. It was early in the morning, but the owner let him in and then agreed to drive him into town. As they were driving down the mountain, they passed Scones' car and then the turquoise and white Montego, parked a ways behind it. Once in town, Scones went to see his doctor and was told that he indeed had had a mild heart attack. When he heard about the missing men, he reported what he'd seen to the authorities. Ted Weir's mother said he was not the kind of person that would ignore anybody asking for help. She recalls how he and Sterling had helped somebody they knew go to the hospital after they were suffering from an overdose of Valium. The report the police considered noteworthy came from a woman who worked at a store in a small hamlet of Brownsville, 30 miles from where the car had been abandoned. March 3rd, the woman said one of the flyers that had been distributed by with the men's picture and offering a $1,250 reward for information about the location of the missing men, she told authorities on February 25th she had seen 4 of them in the store she worked at. She said the men had been riding in a red pickup. The woman said she knew the men were not locals, and they had kind of a wide-eyed look when they came into the store. 2 of the men came into the store while 2 others stayed outside using the phone. She identified the 2 men using the phone both as Hewitt and Sterling. The owner of the store also said he had seen the red pickup with 4 or 5 men in it. The store owner told police that men whom he believed to be Weir and Hewitt came in and bought burritos, chocolate milk, and soft drinks. The 2 witnesses were considered to be credible, and their statements were added to the record. Weir's brother told the L.A. Times that it was unreasonable to believe his brother would be heading to Brownsville, knowing he was due to play a basketball game the next day. His brother was very focused on any plans he made and wouldn't do anything out of character. He also said the description of his brother buying any kind of food and hanging out with Hewitt was exactly how his brother would act. Hewitt's brother said Jack hated using telephones, and it fell on him to handle any phone calls for his brother. The actions of the men in the store were in line with how their families said they would have behaved. The police were at a standstill as to what might have happened. They'd checked every lead, but still could not find the 5 men. They could only wait until the snow melted to try reaching the mountain. June 4th, most of the higher elevation snow was gone. A group of motorcyclists rode up the mountain to stay at a trailer which was maintained by the Forest Service. The campsite was about 20 miles from where the Montego had been found. This was straight-line distance. Once they arrived at the trailer, the bikers found one of the windows was broken. As they pulled the front door open, the smell of decomposition hit them. The bikers contacted the sheriff's office, and deputies were sent to the scene. Inside the trailer, they found the badly decomposed body of Ted Weir. The searchers returned to Plymouth and began following the road between the trailer and the site of the Montego had been found. The following day, the searchers found the remains of 2 men on the other side of the road, 11 miles from where the car had been found. The bodies were identified as being Madruga and Sterling. These 2 bodies had been partially consumed by scavengers, but there was still enough to identify. Autopsies showed they had both died from hypothermia. Deputies speculate that one of the men had stopped walking and the other just refused to leave him. They both lay there in the bushes until the cold got them. 2 days later, Jack Hewitt's father found his son's body under a manzanita bush 2 miles northeast of the trailer. His shoes and jeans were folded nearby, helping to identify the body. It's common for people dying from exposure to perform what is known as paradoxical undressing. As the body freezes, the blood is shunted to the core to maintain her inner heat. This rush of blood to the core will cause the body's temperature to increase, which leads to the victim feeling warm. This, in turn, leads to taking off clothing. Jack's death was attributed to hypothermia brought on by paradoxical undressing. In an area about a quarter-mile northwest of the trailer, searchers found 3 Forest Service blankets and a rusted flashlight by the side of the road. They couldn't say for certain that these had come from the Forest Service trailer, or that it had anything to do with the 5 men, but it did kind of look like it was connected. Gary Mathias was the only one still not accounted for. He would have run out of his medication shortly after the 5 had been stranded. This may have led to him becoming despondent. His description was sent out to all hospitals and jails in the area. Ted Weir's body, that was found inside the trailer on the bed, had 8 sheets wrapped around it, probably in an attempt to stay warm. The autopsy showed that he had died of a combination of starvation and hypothermia. He'd lost nearly half of his 200-pound body mass. His beard had grown enough to suggest he had lived about 13 weeks from when he had last shaved. His feet were badly frostbitten, his shoes were nowhere to be found. On a table next to the bed were some of his personal effects, including his wallet, a nickel ring with Ted engraved on it, a gold necklace that he often wore. Also on the table was a gold watch that was missing its crystal that the Weir family said was not his. There was also a partially melted candle. What the investigators found most puzzling was how Weir had come to his fate. The fireplace had not been utilized, even though there was plenty of fuel to sustain a fire for some time. The trailer had heavy forestry clothing, which could have kept Ted and the rest of the men warm, also remained where it had been stored. Right next to the trailer was a storage shed that held emergency food. A dozen sea ration cans had been opened and their contents were consumed, but there was an even greater assortment of dehydrated food that had not been touched. There was enough food to have kept 5 men alive for about a year. Also in the shed was a butane tank and a burner that could have been used to keep them warm for several weeks. It seems as if Weir had not been alone in the trailer. Matthias and possibly Hewitt had been there with him. Matthias's tennis shoes were in the trailer, and the sea rations had been opened with a P-38 can opener, which Matthias would have learned how to use during his Army service. The deputies theorized Matthias may have taken Ted's shoes if his feet had swollen enough to make his own shoes too tight. This combined with a number of sheets wrapped around Ted's body as if somebody had taken time to try to help him stay warm. Even knowing that 4 of the 5 men had died in the Sierra, investigators still could not completely explain what had led to their deaths. They still had found no explanation for why the men were so far from where they were supposed to be. The authorities learned that Matthias had friends in a small town of Forbestown, and they believe it was possible that in an attempt to visit them on the way back home, the men may have taken a wrong turn near Orville that put them on the mountain road. This was just speculation, having absolutely no evidence to back it up. Then there was the odd thing of the men walking so far through the woods until they came to the forestry trailer. When people become lost in the woods, they tend to walk in a circle rather than in a straight line, and they usually will wind up pretty close to where they had started. The day before the men went missing, a Forest Service snowcat had gone along the road, driving to the trailer to clear the roof of snow. The authorities think that the 5 men had followed the snowcat tracks through the woods to wind up at the trailer, but once again they had nothing to support this idea. Just a theory. Why the men had driven up the mountain, when they all knew there was a big game the next day, nobody can answer. Why they didn't follow the road back down the mountain instead of walking off-road away from the car is also a mystery. Did the 5 men ignore the calls for help from Scones, and if they did, how come? Who was the woman that Scones thinks he saw with the men? To this day, Gary Matthias is still missing. He may have wandered away, lost inside his own delusions, suffering from schizophrenia, or he may have died somewhere out in the woods. All the families have when they think about the deaths of their sons is more questions. Who was driving the red pickup? Why did the men go into a town and then turn around and go back out to where the car was abandoned? Could it be they thought, well, we'll pick up some supplies and then we'll go back and get our car unstuck? If so, who drove them and why? Just too many questions come up every time I read this story. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, well, tell your friends. Let them know what they're missing. If you have any suggestions for future shows, you can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Just send me a few words suggesting what you'd like to hear, and I'll do some research and see if I can make an hour show out of it. If not, I'll put several shows together and see what we can come up with. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man. They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.